Hi, my name is David Christopher Lane. I'm a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and the founder of the Neurosurfer YouTube channel. Before we talk about tonight's audiobook, I got to tell you about how warm the water is. I just got out of the water at Newport and it was about 72. Now it's been warm above 70 for several weeks now, which is really kind of unheard of in Southern California. I even heard reports that La Jolla Shores has water of 76. But I want to tell you a little secret. The warmest water you'll ever experience is not in Hawaii. It's not even in Florida. It's in Seal Beach, California. When there's a heat wave, what happens is there's an electric plant down the way at Las Alamedas, all the way down, and it sends warm water all the way up the river at the Seal Beach River jetties. When you go there, the water can get, and I've actually measured it, at 92 degrees. In fact, it was so hot once, I still remember this filming it because I knew nobody would believe me. It was steaming off the water in the ocean because there was cold air, and it looked like it was like the world's biggest whirlpool. So knowing my sense of humor and always trying to punk my older brother, who I love dearly, Joseph, I told him that the water was super cold at Seal Beach and that he had to wear a full-on wetsuit. It's 4'3" O'Neill. And it was real thick. And I said, oh yeah, guys, cold water's really cold. So he's paddling out and he gets into the river and the water's like so warm he couldn't believe it. And he's trying to pull his wetsuit off. He's yelling and screaming at me. You knew this was going to be super warm. In fact, for me, I remember surfing it many, many times. The water's a little funky, so you got to be careful, but you can get a long ride down the river. And I remember jumping into the water and feeling too hot. Like literally, like putting your head inside a jacuzzi. It was a wonderful. I haven't surfed there in a long time. I haven't surfed there probably in, gosh, it must be about 15 years. Primarily because the water is a little funky because there's a lot of debris coming out, especially after it rains. Now, today I want to talk about Mount Everest. And what we've done is a narrative history of Mount Everest about why it's considered a sacred mountain, but at the same point I want to make is why people had such a desire to conquer it or to climb it. And as you know, today, many, many people have climbed it. But back in the day, it was extremely difficult, especially without oxygen. And it was not until I think 1953 that it was finally gotten to the summit by Hillary and Tenzing. So why am I interested in Mount Everest? Well, I tell you what happened. I was teaching at Moreau High School back in 79, 80, and I used to read in the library various books. And one book I got was the first Americans, I think it was Americans on Everest. And one of the guys who wrote the book was at UCLA, and he was always thinking about climbing. And I got fascinated by it. And I got fascinated by reading all sorts of mountain books. But I think there's a reason we're fascinated by mountain books, and the same reason we're fascinated by adventure stories, or whether it's going to the South Pole or whether it's going to the North Pole. We like to see us struggle beyond what we think we are capable of, or for instance, big wave surfing, whether it's at Nazare or whether it's at Jaws or Pipeline. And this desire for me to read mountain books was metaphorical, had a lot to do with the idea of trying to achieve something that was beyond my reach. And so they always become inspirational. And so in a strange way, if you're into kind of trying to change your life or make your life better, mountaineering books are really a good read and a good inspiration for trying to make your life better or to improve it or to push yourself beyond the limits. Because you see these people that climb these mountains are at the very edge of the limits of how much oxygen they can give and how they can survive, how cold it is and the frostbite and all that. So this is a narrative history, but also an adventure story about Mount Everest. And one last thing about the warm water, I just hope it lasts. Thank you.
The Goddess and the Summit. History of the dreamers, explorers, eccentrics, scientists, Sherpas, and mountaineers who sought the top of Everest. A note on names, and on the word conquered. Mount Everest has carried several names because it has existed within several different worlds of meaning. In Tibetan, it is usually rendered in English as Chomolungma, Chomolungma, or Chomolungma, depending on the system of transliteration. The name is often translated as Goddess Mother of the World, although, as with many old place names, its precise etymology is more complicated than a single English phrase suggests. In Nepal, the mountain is officially known as Sagarmatha, a modern Nepali name proposed in the 20th century and commonly interpreted as head of the sky or forehead of the heavens. In the international mountaineering literature, it became Mount Everest after a 19th century British surveyor who never saw the mountain and who objected to having his name attached to it. The word conquered, once standard in accounts of Everest, also requires qualification. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay completed the first documented and universally accepted ascent on May 29, 1953. But the mountain was not subdued. It did not surrender, become safe, or cease to be sacred. Nor was the summit won by two men acting alone. Their ascent rested upon more than 30 years of reconnaissance, failure, death, scientific experiment, Tibetan and Nepali permission, Indian surveying, Swiss route finding, British organization, New Zealand climbing, and the labor and expertise of generations of Sherpa, Bhutia, Tibetan, Nepali, and other Himalayan workers. What happened in 1953 was not so much the conquest of a mountain as the culmination of a long human argument with altitude. Prologue. The mountain before the climbers. From the Tibetan plateau, Everest does not initially appear as the theatrical white pyramid imagined by people who know it only from photographs. The northern approach is vast and austere. The traveler advances through a high, dry world of ochre hills, wind-polished stones, frozen streams, Buddhist monasteries, grazing animals, and settlements separated by distances that seem to enlarge beneath the sky. The air is already thin before the climbing has begun. Far ahead, above the Rongbuk Valley, the mountain's upper ridges may appear almost suspended, dark rock and pale snow rising beyond a procession of lesser summits. From Nepal, the experience is different. Everest remains hidden for much of the approach. The traveler enters the deep valleys of the Dudkosi, moves through forests of pine and rhododendron, crosses rivers on precarious bridges, and climbs through Sherpa villages and cultivated terraces. Above the tree line, the valley widens into a harsher country of glaciers and moraine. Even then, Everest is partly concealed behind Nuptse and Lhotse. The southern route reveals its problems one at a time: the moving chaos of the Khumbu icefall, the dazzling enclosure of the western Sidabuduem, the blue ice of the Lhotse face, the wind-swept saddle of the South Col, and finally the exposed southeast ridge. The mountain is not merely high. Its height reshapes every ordinary act. Walking becomes labor. Digestion falters. Water must be manufactured by melting snow. Sleep becomes intermittent. A climber may awaken gasping because breathing is slowed. Fingers lose dexterity precisely when stoves, oxygen valves, crampon straps, ropes, and buckles must be managed perfectly. Judgment deteriorates while the need for judgment increases. Near the summit, atmospheric pressure is approximately 1/3 of that at sea level. Every breath, therefore, delivers far fewer oxygen molecules, even though the proportion of oxygen in the air remains essentially unchanged. A well-acclimatized climber at extreme altitude may possess astonishing endurance by ordinary standards, and still be functioning close to the physiological limit of human survival. Thoughts slow. A few steps may require several breaths. A small mechanical failure can become fatal because the climber no longer has the reserves to correct it. Yet before Europeans measured the mountain, before newspapers made it a symbol of imperial ambition, and before climbers argued over oxygen cylinders and summit tactics, the people around Everest already knew that the landscape demanded humility. They did not need a survey to tell them that the mountain possessed power. Part 1. The Sacred Mountain. 1. Chomolungma and the Tibetan World. The idea that Everest was discovered by British surveyors is historically misleading. Surveyors identified it as the highest point on Earth, according to modern measurements, but the mountain itself was already known, named, mapped, approached, and incorporated into Tibetan geographical and religious understanding. A Qing imperial survey, conducted with the assistance of Jesuit cartographers in the early 18th century, recorded a recognizable version of the name on maps produced around 1717 to 1718. European atlases subsequently reproduced variants of it. Long before the designation Peak 15 appeared in British calculations, Chomolungma belonged to an inhabited cultural landscape. To understand Tibetan attitudes toward Everest, one must set aside the modern obsession with ranking. Western geographical science made Everest singular because it was the highest. Tibetan sacred geography did not necessarily confer greatest sanctity upon the mountain with the greatest elevation. Mountains acquired importance through myth, pilgrimage, monastic associations, protective deities, tantric geography, local history, and relationships with the communities living around them. Everest was sacred, but it did not occupy exactly the same position in Tibetan Buddhism that Mount Kailash did as a major pilgrimage center. Chomolungma became associated with Sangma, often described as one of the 5 sisters of long life. Traditions surrounding these female deities developed through Tibetan Buddhist reinterpretations of older local powers. Sangma came to be connected with prosperity, inexhaustible giving, good fortune, and the wealth of the landscape. In Sherpa and Tibetan religious geography, her wealth could include crops, animals, trade, and, in a striking modern adaptation, the economic opportunities created by mountaineering and tourism. Such traditions did not freeze the mountain outside history. They provided a language through which changing relationships with it could be understood. The Rongbuk Valley on the northern side became one of the principal thresholds through which 20th century expeditions approached Everest. Near the head of that valley stood Rongbuk Monastery, established in 1902 by Zatul Rinpoche, in a region where hermits and nuns had used caves for generations. Money walls, prayer flags, meditation caves, carved stones, and monastic rituals signaled that the valley was not simply an empty access corridor to a sporting objective. It was a religious environment. Expedition members arriving with crates, tents, cameras, oxygen equipment, rifles, scientific instruments, and columns of animals entered a world organized around very different assumptions. Foreign climbers sometimes described monastery ceremonies as colorful preliminaries to the real work ahead. For the people whose lives were rooted in the region, however, blessings were not theatrical ornaments. A lama's prayers could acknowledge the dangers of disturbing a powerful place, protect travelers, reconcile human ambition with local deities, and establish an ethical relationship with the mountain. This did not mean that every Tibetan believed climbing a mountain was absolutely forbidden, or that Tibetan resistance to expeditions was exclusively religious. Permission to enter the region was entangled with diplomacy, border security, foreign interference, British power in India, monastic authority, and memories of the violent British expedition to Lhasa in 1904. Tibetan officials had excellent political reasons to distrust large foreign parties carrying maps and surveying equipment. Sacred caution and political caution reinforced each other. The early Everest expeditions therefore depended on negotiation. A passport was not merely paperwork. It represented a temporary opening in a society that had deliberately limited foreign entry. When British climbers marched toward Everest, they did so as guests whose ambitions were not necessarily shared by their hosts. 2. The Sherpa Sacred Landscape. On the southern side, the most important cultural distinction is between Nepal as a state and the particular Himalayan communities living nearest Everest. Nepal contains many ethnic groups, languages, religious traditions, and geographical regions. The people most closely associated with the high valleys around Everest are the Sherpas, whose ancestors migrated from eastern Tibet into the region over several centuries. The word Sherpa is an ethnic name, not a synonym for porter. Western speech often transformed it into an occupational label, obscuring the identities of people who were farmers, traders, householders, monastics, animal herders, guides, climbers, entrepreneurs, and ritual specialists. Some Sherpas worked on expeditions, many did not. Those who did brought far more than the ability to carry heavy loads. They brought altitude experience, route judgment, knowledge of snow, skill with animals and camps, and cultural fluency across the borderlands of Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and British India. Khumbu, the Everest region of Nepal, has often been interpreted within the Tibetan Buddhist idea of a Beul, a hidden or protected valley associated with Padmasambhava, the tantric master credited in tradition with establishing Buddhism in Tibet. A Beul was not merely beautiful terrain, it was a refuge whose sacred geography imposed responsibilities. Mountains, forests, springs, cliffs, animals, and local deities belonged to an interdependent moral landscape. Hunting and pollution could be condemned not simply for practical reasons, but because they violated relationships between human communities and the powers inhabiting the land. Everest's southern approaches thus passed through a world in which peaks were not inert piles of rock. Even today, ceremonies performed before climbing commonly seek permission and protection. The famous puja at base camp, in which climbing equipment may be blessed and offerings made, reflects a continuing understanding that technical skill alone does not justify entry onto the mountain. The earliest British expeditions approached Everest from Tibet rather than Nepal, because Nepal remained largely closed to foreign expeditions. Many of the high-altitude workers employed on those northern expeditions were recruited not directly from Khumbu, but from the cosmopolitan Himalayan communities around Darjeeling in British India. Expedition records used overlapping labels: Sherpa, Bhutia, Tibetan, Lepcha, sometimes inconsistently. The men were frequently identified collectively, while the European climbers received individual biographies. Yet the repeated survival and progress of the expeditions depended upon them. This imbalance becomes painfully visible in 1922, when 7 Himalayan porters were killed in an avalanche. Their deaths were not an incidental footnote to a European adventure. They were the first fatalities in an Everest climbing expedition, and they exposed a moral question that would remain throughout the mountain's history. Who accepted the danger? Who received the fame? And whose names were remembered? 3. Sagarmatha and the Nepali nation. The name Sagarmatha is sometimes presented as though it had been used from antiquity by everyone on the Nepali side. Its history is more recent. The historian Baburam Acharya proposed the name in the 1930s, and the Nepali state later adopted it as the official Nepali designation. The term linked the world's highest summit with the language and national identity of Nepal at a time when the internationally dominant name honored a British official. Sagarmatha is commonly translated as head of the sky, forehead of the heavens, or head reaching into the sky. Whatever English rendering one prefers, the name expresses vertical majesty. It also illustrates how mountains acquire new identities as political borders, national consciousness, international tourism, and scientific knowledge change around them. For local Sherpa communities, however, Chomolungma, or related Tibetan-derived forms, remained culturally meaningful. The same mountain could therefore be Chomolungma in a religious and linguistic world, Sagarmatha in the modern Nepali nation, and Everest in international geography. No single name cancels the others. Each records a different relationship. 4. India, Himavat, and the sacred Himalaya. The Indian relationship to Everest must also be described carefully. Everest itself does not occupy the central position in classical Hindu pilgrimage that Kailash, Badrinath, Kedarnath, Gangotri, or other sacred Himalayan locations do. But the Himalaya as a whole possesses enormous religious significance in Indian civilization. In Sanskrit traditions, Himavat or Himalaya appears not only as a mountain range, but as a divine being, famously the father of Parvati, who becomes the consort of Shiva. Early Vedic literature referred to the snowy mountains, and later epics, Puranic traditions, pilgrimage networks, and devotional cultures made the Himalaya a region of gods, sages, ascetics, rivers, revelation, and liberation. The mountains were imagined as the vertical meeting place of earth and heaven, wilderness and divinity, austerity and transcendence. The British identification of Everest as the world's highest mountain took place through the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, a colonial scientific enterprise conducted across the subcontinent by British officials and large numbers of Indian mathematicians, surveyors, instrument handlers, laborers, and assistants. The calculation that made Everest globally famous was therefore inseparable from India, geographically, institutionally, and intellectually. Darjeeling later became the human staging ground for the early expeditions. Climbers gathered there, equipment was sorted there, and high-altitude workers were recruited there. Tenzing Norgay eventually made his home there. The Himalayan Mountaineering Institute would be established there after the 1953 ascent. India's relationship to Everest was thus both sacred and modern. The ancient reverence of the Himalayan world existed alongside colonial surveying, border politics, scientific calculation, and the emergence of organized Asian mountaineering. The summit, when finally reached, would carry flags representing Britain, Nepal, India, and the United Nations. The mountain had become international, but it had never ceased to be Himalayan. Part 2. How a sacred mountain became the highest mountain in the world. 5. Peak 15. During the 18th and 19th centuries, European geographical science became increasingly concerned with measurement, classification, and comparison. Mountain ranges that local peoples understood through names, stories, journeys, watersheds, pastures, trade routes, and sacred sites were reorganized into tables of elevations. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India was among the most ambitious scientific projects of the 19th century. Its surveyors worked across immense distances, using carefully measured baselines, giant theodolites, triangulation, and mathematical corrections for atmospheric refraction and the curvature of the earth. The work was physically punishing. Instruments had to be transported through forests, plains, deserts, mountains, and territories where permission was uncertain. Towers were constructed to establish lines of sight. Observations were repeated and calculations checked. Because Nepal restricted foreign entry, surveyors could not simply place an instrument at the foot of Everest. They measured distant Himalayan peaks from stations across northern India and used triangulation to determine their positions and elevations. In survey records, the mountain that would become Everest was temporarily labeled Peak 15. In 1852, the Indian mathematician and surveyor Radhanath Sikdar is widely credited with recognizing from the accumulated calculations that Peak 15 surpassed the other measured Himalayan summits. Accounts of the precise moment have been embellished, and the bureaucratic process involved more than one calculation and more than one person. Nevertheless, Sikdar's mathematical work was central to establishing the mountain's status. Andrew Waugh, then Surveyor General of India, announced the result publicly in 1856, giving Peak 15 an estimated elevation of 29,002 feet. The figure was remarkably close to later measurements, even though surveyors had worked from great distances through difficult atmospheric conditions. Waugh claimed that he could not identify a single, universally accepted local name. He therefore proposed naming the mountain after his predecessor, Sir George Everest, who had served as Surveyor General and helped develop the survey's methods. The Royal Geographical Society formally adopted Mount Everest in 1865. George Everest himself objected. Among other concerns, he noted that his surname couldn't be written easily in Indian languages and was likely to be pronounced differently from the way his family pronounced it. He had also generally supported the use of local names where they could be established. The irony is considerable. The most famous geographical memorial to British imperial science honored a man who did not discover, measure, or see the mountain, and who did not want it named after him. The name nevertheless endured because imperial institutions possessed the power to standardize maps. Chomolungma was transformed in international consciousness into Everest. This was not merely a change of vocabulary, it was a change in the mountain's conceptual identity. Chomolungma had been a sacred presence within a particular landscape. Peak 15 became a mathematical object. Mount Everest became a global superlative. Once it was called the highest mountain in the world, a new question became almost inevitable. Could a human being stand on top of it? 6. The invention of the Everest problem. The first generation of modern European alpinists had learned their craft in the Alps. By the late 19th century, major alpine summits had been climbed, difficult rock faces attempted, and mountaineering had developed its own culture of clubs, guides, ethics, literature, and prestige. But Everest was not simply an enlarged alpine peak. The technical problems of rock and ice were compounded by distance, climate, political access, uncertain maps, enormous logistical requirements, and an altitude no climber had experienced. An alpine party could begin in a valley and reach a high hut in a day. An Everest expedition first had to cross hundreds of miles, establish successive camps, transport food and fuel, and maintain human beings for weeks in conditions that steadily weakened them. In 1885, the British mountaineer and surgeon Clinton Thomas Dent argued that Everest might eventually be climbed. His judgment was speculative, but it was not fantasy. Alpinists had repeatedly discovered that peaks pronounced impossible became possible when routes, techniques, equipment, and human expectations improved. Other mountaineers echoed the idea in the early 20th century. The primary barrier was access. Nepal remained closed, and Tibet restricted foreigners. British officials periodically considered seeking permission, but mountaineering ambitions were subordinate to imperial diplomacy. In 1907, a proposed Everest expedition was blocked amid wider geopolitical concerns. British authorities were wary of disturbing relations with Tibet and Russia, particularly after the Anglo-Russian Convention and the recent violence of the British mission to Lhasa. The British officer and photographer, John Baptist Lucius Noel, tried a more theatrical solution. In 1913, he entered Tibet in disguise, reportedly darkening his skin with walnut stain and attempting to pass within the region without official authorization. He came within roughly 40 miles of Everest before Tibetan authorities turned him back. Noel learned little about a practicable route, but his adventure intensified his fascination. He would later become one of the chief promoters and visual chroniclers of the early expeditions. More scientifically important was Alexander Mitchell Kellis, a Scottish chemist and mountaineer whose contribution was long overshadowed by more glamorous figures. Kellis was quiet, physically unassuming, and intensely private. He combined climbing with research into the effects of reduced atmospheric pressure. While others speculated about whether the human body could function near 29,000 feet, Kellis tried to calculate it. He climbed extensively in Sikkim and the eastern Himalaya, making numerous high-altitude ascents with small parties of local climbers. He believed Everest might be possible, perhaps even without supplemental oxygen, provided the climbers acclimatized properly and the logistical system allowed them to arrive high on the mountain with sufficient strength. He also recognized that oxygen could increase safety and performance. Kellis anticipated much of the physiological debate that would dominate Everest for 3 decades. He understood that the problem was not merely whether a person could remain conscious at summit altitude. The real question was whether a climber could continue performing mechanical work, cutting steps, managing ropes, crossing dangerous terrain, making decisions, and descending, while profoundly hypoxic. After the First World War, the Royal Geographical Society and Alpine Club renewed the effort. Sir Charles Bell, a British official with rare access to Tibetan leaders and substantial knowledge of Tibetan culture, helped secure permission from the Dalai Lama's government. In January 1921, the 2 British institutions created the Mount Everest Committee to organize an expedition. The dream had become a formal project. The men going to Everest were no longer asking merely whether it might be climbed someday. They were going to find a route. Part 3. The Northern Road. 7. The 1921 Reconnaissance. Learning the shape of the mountain. The 1921 expedition was not intended to force a summit ascent at any cost. Its central purpose was reconnaissance. No reliable map showed how Everest's glaciers, valleys, ridges, and neighboring mountains connected. The climbers had to solve a geographical puzzle before they could solve a mountaineering one. The expedition was led by Charles Howard Berry, an Anglo-Irish soldier, landowner, naturalist, and experienced traveller. He possessed the organizational habits of an imperial officer and the curiosity of a botanical collector. He was not the strongest climber in the party, but he could manage animals, supplies, diplomacy, scientific personnel, and a moving community of hundreds. The climbing members included Kellis, Harold Raeburn, a formidable Scottish mountaineer already in his 50s, Guy Bullock, a diplomat and steady alpinist, and George Lee Mallory, a 35-year-old schoolmaster whose name would become inseparable from Everest. The surveyors included Henry Morshead and Oliver Wheeler. Alexander Heron studied the geology, while Sandy Wollaston served as physician and naturalist. Mallory was not yet a public legend. He was known within British climbing circles as a gifted and graceful rock climber. He moved with an elegance that friends found almost aesthetic. He was handsome, socially magnetic, sometimes absent-minded, and capable of intense concentration on a route. His great strength was not brute endurance, but the ability to look at complicated terrain and imagine a line through it. The party left Darjeeling in May and undertook a journey of roughly 300 miles. It crossed Sikkim, moved over the Jelep La, entered the Chumbi Valley, and continued through settlements and broad reaches of the Tibetan Plateau. Everything needed for the expedition traveled by human back or pack animal: food, tents, bedding, surveying instruments, photographic plates, climbing equipment, medical supplies, and boxes whose contents could be ruined by one river crossing or one animal's fall. Before the party reached Everest, tragedy struck. Kellis became ill and died near Kampadzong on June 5th. He had spent years preparing intellectually and physically for the mountain and died almost within sight of the objective. The man who had thought most deeply about Everest physiology never reached its base. Rayburn also became seriously ill and could play only a limited role. Responsibility for route exploration increasingly fell to Mallory and Bullock. At first, Everest did not yield its structure. From the main Rongbuk Glacier, Mallory examined the northern side, but failed to identify the crucial branch leading through the East Rongbuk Glacier to the North Kola. Glaciers that appear connected from one angle may be separated by ridges. Valleys hidden behind spurs can remain invisible until a traveler stands almost at their entrances. The party moved eastward through the Kata region and entered the Kama Valley. There they saw the enormous Kangshung face, Everest's eastern wall. It was beautiful and appalling, a vast architecture of hanging glaciers, avalanche channels, rock buttresses, and ice cliffs. Mallory concluded that it did not offer a reasonable line. Even modern climbers regard the Kangshung side as one of Everest's most formidable environments. From the east, the explorers climbed toward the Lakpa La, a high pass overlooking the Upper East Rongbuk Glacier. At last, the geography became intelligible. Across the glacier stood the North Col, the snowy saddle between Everest and Changtse. Above it rose the North Ridge, connecting with the Northeast Ridge and the Summit Pyramid. Mallory saw the outline of the route that would dominate every pre-war attempt: reach the iced Rongbuk Glacier, climb to the North Col, establish camps on the North Ridge, traverse the Northeast Ridge, overcome its rock steps, and continue to the summit. On September 23rd, Mallory, Bullock, and Wheeler reached the North Col at approximately 23,000 feet. The achievement was more exploratory than technical, but it brought them into a new world. The wind struck with extraordinary force. Snow streamed from Everest's crest in a long plume, evidence of the high-altitude winds that could make the upper mountain uninhabitable. The climbers were exhausted, the season advanced, and the expedition had neither the supplies nor the acclimatization to continue. They descended. The summit remained more than a vertical mile above them. Yet the essential problem had changed. Everest was no longer a blank mass on the horizon. It possessed a possible route. Mallory had found the door. 8. What the climbers were up against. The North Col route was deceptively logical. On a map, its sequence appeared straightforward. In practice, each stage consumed strength. The expedition first had to establish a base near the Rongbuk Glacier. Loads then moved through the East Rongbuk system to successively higher camps. The North Col itself required movement over a glacier broken by crevasses and, depending on the year, guarded by steep snow or ice. Above the col, camps had to be placed on the exposed north ridge, where winds could flatten tents and destroy supplies. From the upper ridge, climbers faced the northeast ridge and its three major rock obstacles, later known as the first, second, and third steps. The second step was especially threatening, a steep rock barrier at approximately 28,000 feet. Below the ridge lay the north face and the Great Couloir, later called the Northern Couloir, which offered a possible traverse but exposed climbers to loose rock, hard snow, and immense falls. The equipment of the 1920s now appears primitive, but it represented the best available adaptation of alpine practice. Climbers wore layers of wool beneath wind-resistant outer garments. Their leather boots were heavy, stiff, and difficult to dry. Crampons existed, but were not yet used with the universality and sophistication familiar today. Climbers often cut steps in hard snow or ice with long shafted axes, a slow and exhausting operation. Ropes offered companionship and some security, but were not part of the extensive fixed-line systems used on contemporary commercial routes. Tents were fragile, stoves were unreliable, weather forecasts were rudimentary. Radio communication between camps did not exist. Once climbers left a high camp, those below often knew nothing until they returned, or failed to return. Every object became heavier with altitude. An oxygen cylinder that improved a climber's breathing also increased the load carried. A malfunctioning apparatus could waste energy and create false confidence. Even a camera had to be operated with numb hands and carried back if its photographs were to survive. The climbers also had to learn acclimatization through experience. Ascending too rapidly could produce headache, nausea, weakness, confusion, pulmonary distress, collapse, or death. Remaining too long at great altitude caused progressive deterioration. The expedition therefore faced a paradox. It needed time to acclimatize and stock camps, but every day spent high weakened the very people expected to make the summit attempt. Everest was not a single climb. It was a campaign against exhaustion. Part 4. The First Assaults. 9. 1922. The mountain takes its first lives. The 1922 expedition was the first organized attempt explicitly intended to reach the summit. It was led by Brigadier General Charles Granville Bruce, a cheerful, robust veteran of the Gurkha regiments, who possessed an unusually easy relationship with Himalayan peoples for a British officer of his generation. Bruce spoke regional languages, enjoyed the company of the high-altitude workers, and understood that morale could not be maintained by military commands alone. The climbing team was exceptionally strong. Mallory returned, now carrying the authority of the man who had discovered the route. So did Morshead. They were joined by Edward Norton, a quiet cavalry officer of immense steadiness, Howard Somerville, a surgeon, artist, musician, and powerful climber, George Finch, an Australian-born chemist and one of the most imaginative equipment innovators of his age, Geoffrey Bruce, the leader's nephew, and others. The expedition carried bottled oxygen, provoking a dispute that was technical, moral, and almost philosophical. Some climbers regarded supplemental oxygen as an artificial aid inconsistent with the purity of mountaineering. Others doubted whether the heavy, unreliable apparatus would deliver enough benefit to justify its weight. Finch argued from evidence. At extreme altitude, oxygen was not a magical elevator, but it could allow the body to perform more work and remain warmer and clearer-headed. Finch also challenged conventional clothing. Rather than dress according to the sober aesthetics of British alpine climbing, he favored highly insulated garments, including an ungainly eiderdown coat. Some companions found him eccentric or insufficiently clubbable. On the mountain, his ideas proved prescient. The first major summit attempt was made without oxygen. On May 21st, Mallory, Norton, Somerville, and Morshead climbed from a high camp on the North Ridge. They moved slowly, struggled with deep snow and altitude, and reached approximately 26,985 feet, higher than human beings had previously climbed. Morshead deteriorated badly during the descent and suffered severe frostbite. His companions helped him down through terrain where one weak climber could endanger the entire rope. Their height record was astonishing, but the result revealed the scale of the remaining problem. They had climbed higher than any previous mountaineers and were still roughly 2,000 vertical feet below the summit. The second attempt became the first great demonstration of supplemental oxygen. On May 27th, Finch and Geoffrey Bruce climbed with oxygen apparatus, accompanied for part of the ascent by Tejbir Bora, a Gurkha non-commissioned officer. Finch and Bruce reached approximately 27,320 feet, surpassing the previous record. Their progress showed that oxygen could materially improve performance. Finch later described the psychological and physical transformation when the gas flowed properly. The climber's pace improved, warmth returned, and the sense of suffocation diminished. But the apparatus remained temperamental. Tubes froze or leaked, valves required adjustment, and cylinders added substantial weight. Tejbir's role was important, not only as support, but as evidence that Himalayan climbers were participating in the high-altitude experimentation itself. The expedition might have ended with those two extraordinary records. Instead, Mallory pressed for another attempt after new snow had fallen. On June 7th, Mallory, Somerville, and Colin Crawford began climbing toward the North Col with a group of Himalayan porters carrying loads. The slope was heavily laden. Mallory selected a line across it. A slab of snow broke away. The avalanche swept 9 men downward. The Europeans and several porters escaped or were dug out. 7 Himalayan workers were buried and killed. Expedition records preserve their names in varying spellings, commonly rendered as Lakpa, Norbu, Pasang, Pema, Sangha, Temba, and Dorje. Mallory was devastated. He understood that his decision to take the slope had contributed to the disaster. In the moral language of his era, he sometimes framed the deaths as the price of exploration, yet his private response carried grief and guilt. The avalanche destroyed any remaining hope of another attempt. The 7 dead men transformed the story of Everest. Until then, the expedition had presented itself as heroic reconnaissance and sporting endeavor. The avalanche revealed the asymmetry hidden inside that heroism. European climbers chose the objective and received public acclaim. Himalayan workers often carried the heaviest loads through the most dangerous sections because the expedition's structure required them to do so. The mountain had issued its first terrible accounting. 10. Because it is there. After the 1922 expedition, Mallory traveled in the United States to lecture and raise funds. He was repeatedly asked why anyone should want to climb Everest. His famous answer, "Because it is there," has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of exploration. The phrase is compelling because it appears to eliminate explanation. Everest's existence becomes sufficient reason for the attempt. Yet Mallory's actual motives were more complicated. He was drawn by beauty, difficulty, national expectation, personal ambition, loyalty to his companions, and the desire to complete what he had begun. Everest had entered his imagination as an unfinished composition. He had found its northern route, climbed upon it, and watched others die there. Each failure deepened rather than weakened its hold. The public turned him into the embodiment of a pure explorer. But Mallory was neither a simple daredevil nor a machine of imperial ambition. He had a wife, Ruth, and young children. He taught at Charterhouse. He moved among writers, artists, and members of the Bloomsbury Circle. Friends described a man of charm and physical grace, but also one capable of detachment when consumed by climbing. By 1924, he knew that age and circumstance might deny him another opportunity. He would be 38 that year, hardly old, but old enough to wonder how many expeditions his body and family could endure. Everest was becoming his last chance. Part 5. The Great Mystery of 1924. 11. A stronger expedition and a failing leader. The 1924 expedition again approached through Tibet. General Bruce remained the formal leader, but he became ill during the journey, and command passed to Edward Norton. Norton was almost the opposite of the flamboyant expedition hero. He was reserved, disciplined, and reluctant to exaggerate. His authority arose from competence rather than theatrical command. Under pressure, he remained calm. This quality became crucial as illness, weather, logistical delays, and disagreements over oxygen complicated the expedition. The team included Mallory, Somervell, Geoffrey Bruce, Noel Odell, Bentley Beetham, John de Vars Hazard, and a 22-year-old Oxford engineering student named Andrew Sandy Irvine. Irvine was a powerful rower, physically robust, cheerful, and mechanically ingenious. He had relatively little high-level mountaineering experience, but he could dismantle, repair, and improve the troublesome oxygen sets. The expedition gradually established camps up the East Rongbuk Glacier and on to the North Col. The high-altitude workers carried loads through repeated journeys that cost them strength. Winds damaged tents, snow conditions changed. Each camp above the col represented a precarious island of canvas, food, fuel, and oxygen. The first serious summit effort by Mallory and Geoffrey Bruce failed before reaching the final assault position. The strain of climbing and establishing camps consumed too much energy. Norton and Somervell then prepared to attempt the summit without supplemental oxygen. Their decision was not simply romantic traditionalism. Oxygen equipment remained unreliable, and carrying it imposed a penalty. Norton and Somervell believed that a well-acclimatized team moving steadily might climb more effectively without it. They were about to test the unaided human body closer to its limit than anyone before them. 12. Norton and Somervell enter the thin air world. On June 4th, Norton and Somervell left their high camp and climbed toward the northeast ridge. Their pace slowed as altitude stripped power from their muscles. The terrain was not technically extreme by lower altitude standards, but nothing at 28,000 feet can be judged by lower altitude standards. Somervell began to weaken. Norton continued alone, traversing across the north face rather than attempting the crest and its rock steps. He entered the Great Couloir, a diagonal gully cutting through the upper face. Without oxygen, alone, and wearing the equipment of 1924, Norton reached approximately 28,126 feet, or 8,573 meters. He was less than 300 vertical meters below the summit. The height record would stand for decades for a climber without supplemental oxygen. Norton later wrote without bombast. He recognized that the summit appeared close, but distance at that altitude becomes deceptive. A few hundred meters can require hours. The slope above him was difficult, the day was passing, and he was weakening. He turned around. Somervell, meanwhile, experienced one of the most terrifying medical crises in early mountaineering. His throat became obstructed by dried material and inflamed tissue. He could barely breathe. During the descent, he sat down believing he might die, pressed on his chest, coughed violently, and dislodged the obstruction. He then continued downward. It is difficult to overstate the force of that survival. Somerville was a surgeon and understood what was happening, yet knowledge could not provide oxygen. He had to clear his airway, while already profoundly hypoxic, exhausted, and exposed high on Everest. Norton and Somerville returned alive, but neither was capable of another immediate summit attempt. The expedition's final hope reverted to Mallory. 13. Mallory chooses Irvine. Mallory decided to use supplemental oxygen. That choice represented a significant change. He had previously expressed doubts, but the performances of Finch in 1922 and the condition of Norton and Somerville in 1924 demonstrated the potential advantage. For his partner, Mallory chose Sandy Irvine rather than the more experienced Noel Odell. The decision has been debated ever since. Irvine's ability to manage the oxygen sets was probably central. Mallory may also have trusted his strength, temperament, and willingness to follow instructions. But the choice paired Everest's most experienced route finder with a young man who had never faced technical climbing of that magnitude at extreme altitude. They climbed toward the final camps on June 6th and 7th. Supporting high-altitude workers helped establish their position, then descended. Mallory sent down a note indicating his intended schedule and asking Odell to watch for them. On June 8th, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp carrying oxygen. Odell climbed below them, combining geological work with support duties. At approximately 12:50 p.m., the clouds briefly opened. Odell saw two black figures moving high on the ridge. One appeared to surmount a prominent rock step. He later described them as moving rapidly and going strong for the top. Then the clouds closed again. That was the last confirmed sighting of Mallory and Irvine alive. Odell climbed to their high camp and found no one. He searched, shouted, and attempted to signal through the mist. The weather deteriorated. He eventually descended, still hoping that the pair might appear below. They never did. 14. Did they reach the summit? The disappearance created the most persistent mystery in mountaineering history. Odell initially believed that he had seen Mallory and Irvine negotiating the second step, which would have placed them high on the northeast ridge. He later became less certain about which rock obstacle he had observed. Several possibilities remain. They may have fallen before reaching the summit. They may have been delayed at one of the steps. Their oxygen might have failed. They may have reached the summit late and died during the descent. Mallory, an outstanding rock climber at lower altitude, might conceivably have overcome terrain that later climbers considered extremely difficult, but whether he could have done so in hobnailed boots with a primitive oxygen set after hours at extreme altitude remains uncertain. No direct evidence proves that they stood on the summit. The question acquired emotional force because Mallory's story seemed designed for myth. He had discovered the route, returned after death and failure, uttered the most famous sentence in exploration, and vanished within sight of the goal. Irvine, young and mechanically gifted, became the lost companion whose unwritten future intensified the tragedy. But historical discipline requires a distinction between possibility and confirmation. Hillary and Tenzing's 1953 ascent remains the first documented and universally accepted ascent because they reached the summit, returned alive, reported their route, produced photographs, and were witnessed through a continuous expeditionary chain. Mallory and Irvine belong to a different category, not disproven summiteers, but unconfirmed ones. Their disappearance also altered the emotional climate of Everest. The mountain was no longer merely difficult, it was haunted. Every later climber passing beneath the northeast ridge entered a landscape where two men had vanished into cloud. Part 6. Return to the haunted ridge. 15. The Long Pause. After 1924, financial difficulties and Tibetan reluctance delayed another expedition. The British authorities had to negotiate anew. Tibet had not forgotten the disruption caused by earlier parties, and a diplomatic incident involving Tibetan monastic performers in Britain further complicated relations. During the pause, mountaineering changed. Equipment improved incrementally. Climbers debated whether Everest required a massive expedition or a small, highly mobile team. The oxygen controversy continued. Some treated the mountain as a problem that could be solved through greater logistical force. Others believed large parties became slow, wasteful, and vulnerable to bureaucracy. The memory of Mallory and Irvine hung over every discussion. The next expedition would not be entering unexplored terrain. It would be retracing the steps of the dead. 16. 1933. Rutledge, Smythe, Shipton, and Irvine's axe. Permission was finally granted for a 1933 expedition led by Hugh Rutledge, a former Indian civil service officer and experienced Himalayan traveller. Rutledge was 48 and walked with a lasting impairment from an earlier injury. He was not the finest technical climber in the team, but he possessed patience, administrative experience, and an ability to manage a large organization. The expedition was enormous. It included climbers, scientists, military personnel, communications equipment, large numbers of animals, and 72 Sherpa and Bhutia high-altitude workers. The scale reflected the belief that Everest could be overcome by establishing a powerful logistical chain. Among the climbers were Frank Smythe, Eric Shipton, Lawrence Wager, Percy Wynne Harris, Colin Kirkus, and others. Shipton was wiry, exploratory, and skeptical of grand apparatus. Smythe was a professional mountaineer, writer, photographer, and botanist whose sensitivity to the mountain world coexisted with exceptional toughness. Wager was a geologist and strong climber. Wynne Harris was athletic and determined. The party approached Rongbuk and received a ceremonial blessing. The Lama used ritual objects and prayers to secure protection. For the expedition, the ceremony marked the beginning of the climb. For the monastery, it placed the foreign endeavor within a sacred order the climbers didn't fully understand. Wager and Wynne Harris made the first major summit attempt. On the northeast ridge, Wynne Harris found an ice axe lying among the rocks. Its identification linked it to the 1924 disappearance, and it was generally believed to have belonged to Irvine. The object had remained high on the mountain for 9 years, a fragment of an unfinished story. The pair examined the second step, but did not find a reasonable line. They instead followed the traverse, pioneered by Norton, toward the Great Couloir. The terrain, altitude, and time forced them to retreat. Shipton and Smythe then prepared for another attempt, but Shipton became ill. Smythe continued alone from the high camp. His solo climb was one of the most extraordinary episodes of the pre-war expeditions. Smythe reached approximately 28,120 feet, close to Norton's high point. He was profoundly exhausted and increasingly aware that continuing would leave insufficient strength for descent. He turned around. During the climb, Smythe experienced a vivid sensation that someone accompanied him. At one point, he broke a piece of Kendal mint cake and began to offer half to his invisible companion before recognizing that he was alone. The episode is now often interpreted as a third man phenomenon, a sensed presence reported by people under extreme physical and psychological stress. Smythe survived because, beneath his romantic temperament, he retained disciplined judgment. He understood that a summit reached without the strength to descend was not success. The expedition ended without a summit, but it strengthened several conclusions. The upper northeast ridge was formidable. Norton's traverse remained possible, but exhausting. Large logistical systems could place climbers high, yet they could not guarantee that those climbers arrived strong enough to finish. Everest had not been defeated by insufficient courage. It was defeating the conversion of courage into sustained work. Part 7. The Man Who Tried to Climb Everest Alone. 17. Maurice Wilson's Private Crusade. In 1934, Everest drew an adventurer unlike the trained mountaineers of the official expeditions. Maurice Wilson had served in the First World War, received the Military Cross, and suffered serious wounds. The war left him physically damaged and, by reasonable inference from his later life, psychologically unsettled. In the post-war years, he moved restlessly through business ventures and travel. He eventually became convinced that fasting and prayer had cured his ailments, and that spiritual faith possessed powers modern society had forgotten. Wilson conceived an astonishing plan. He would fly from Britain toward Everest, crash land high on the mountain, and walk to the summit alone. The feat would demonstrate the power of faith. He possessed neither serious flying experience nor high-altitude mountaineering skill. Wilson bought a small D.E. Havilland Gypsy Moth aircraft, named it Everest, and learned to fly. His training did not transform him into an expert pilot, but he departed Britain in 1933 and made his way toward India, despite official attempts to prevent him. When authorities blocked further flight, he sold the aircraft and continued planning from Darjeeling. He recruited 3 Himalayan men with previous expedition experience: Tawang, Rinzing, and Tsering. To cross into Tibet without authorization, the party disguised itself as Buddhist pilgrims. Wilson reportedly pretended to be deaf and mute to conceal his inability to speak the necessary languages. They reached Rongbuk in April 1934. Wilson then attempted to climb largely alone, expecting to use camps, steps, or ropes left by the 1933 expedition. This assumption revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of Everest. Snow-erased tracks, wind-destroyed markers. Fixed ropes did not remain dependable for a year. A route that had been climbed once did not become a maintained path. Wilson lacked crampon technique and experience moving on steep ice. He became lost, snowblind, exhausted, and injured, then retreated to the monastery. His companions helped him return to the old camps. He attempted the North Col repeatedly, but could not overcome the steep ice and broken terrain. His determination was tremendous. His technical preparation was catastrophically inadequate. On May 29th, he left for another solo attempt. His final diary entry was dated May 31st. A reconnaissance party found his body in 1935 near an abandoned tent below the North Col. The diary lay with him. It is easy to caricature Wilson as a fool. He was undeniably deluded about what faith could substitute for. Yet ridicule misses the human tragedy. He was a decorated veteran who had survived mechanized war, struggled to construct meaning afterward, and attached his hope of redemption to the highest mountain on earth. He possessed courage, endurance, and astonishing resourcefulness. What he lacked was the humility of craft. Everest punishes the belief that conviction can replace competence. Part 8. Small parties, great weather, and the rise of Tenzing. 18. Shipton's 1935 reconnaissance. The reaction against enormous expeditions found its champion in Eric Shipton. Shipton loved exploration, more than siege operations. He preferred a handful of companions, light equipment, improvised routes, and the freedom to investigate valleys rather than administer a mobile army. In 1935, he led a small reconnaissance expedition to Everest. The party included Bill Tillman, Charles Warren, Edmund Wigram, Edwin Kempson, Dan Bryant, and surveyor Michael Spender. Instead of focusing solely on the summit, they studied monsoon conditions, examined possible routes, tested food and equipment, explored neighboring peaks, and evaluated new climbers. Among the young high-altitude workers selected in Darjeeling was Tenzing Norgay. His exact birthplace and early chronology have been represented differently in various accounts, reflecting the fluid identities and records of the Himalayan borderlands. What is clear is that he emerged from the Tibetan Sherpa world, came to Darjeeling, and wanted intensely to join an Everest expedition. According to later accounts, his vitality and smile helped him gain selection. He was still at the beginning of his mountaineering career, but Everest had entered his life. The expedition reached the North Col during the monsoon, when deep snow made a summit attempt impractical. Shipton's party, nevertheless, achieved an extraordinary exploratory record, climbing 26 peaks above 20,000 feet, 24 of them first ascents. They found Maurice Wilson's body and buried him near where he had died. From viewpoints north of Everest, Shipton and Bryant also examined the hidden southern geography. They could see portions of the Khumbu icefall and western CWM. The icefall appeared terrible, but not necessarily impossible. This observation would matter 16 years later. Shipton's expedition demonstrated that a small team could explore effectively, acclimatize, and move with flexibility, but exploration and summit assault were different enterprises. A tiny party might discover the route. It might not possess enough human strength to carry camps, oxygen, food, and emergency support to the final ridge. The argument between lightness and logistical power remained unresolved. 1936. The monsoon defeats an army. Rutledge returned in 1936 with the largest Everest expedition yet assembled. Its size reflected lessons from earlier failures. More climbers, more support, more equipment, portable radios, and a stronger system for stocking the mountain. Tenzing returned as one of the high-altitude workers. So did several men whose accumulated experience was becoming as valuable as that of the European climbers. The expedition initially made rapid progress. Parties reached the North Col in early May. During the route work, Rinzing, a Himalayan climber, took a leading role on a difficult section, an important indication that the supposedly fixed distinction between European climbers and Himalayan porters did not reflect the reality of the mountain. Then the weather changed. The monsoon arrived unusually early. Snow accumulated in immense quantities. Slopes became unstable. Tracks vanished beneath fresh drifts. Climbers sank to their knees or thighs, expending extraordinary energy for minimal progress. Avalanches swept the mountainsides. Shipton and Wynne Harris narrowly survived one slide. At extreme altitude, deep snow is more than an inconvenience. Every step requires lifting the leg, driving the foot forward, compacting a platform, and raising the body. The climber becomes overheated beneath clothing, then chilled when movement stops. Trail breaking exhausts the strongest person quickly. Those behind may move more easily, but only if enough climbers remain strong enough to rotate the lead. The North Col became too dangerous to occupy. Camps and equipment had to be abandoned. The expedition retreated in June without a realistic summit attempt. The failure damaged Rutledge's reputation in some British circles, but the weather would probably have defeated any expedition. No amount of organizational scale could stabilize avalanche-prone snow. Everest had answered mass with weather. 20. 1938. Tillman's austere experiment. For the 1938 expedition, leadership passed to Bill Tillman, one of the most austere figures in British exploration. Tillman had served with distinction in the First World War, farmed in Africa, explored with Shipton, and developed a style of dry humor that concealed formidable endurance. He rejected unnecessary comfort and distrusted bloated organizations. His Everest team was comparatively small and included Shipton, Smythe, Noel Odell, Charles Warren, Peter Lloyd, and Peter Oliver. Tenzing again joined the high-altitude personnel. The expedition experimented with both open-circuit and closed-circuit oxygen sets, but Tillman remained skeptical about whether oxygen was practical or consistent with his conception of mountaineering. The ethical debate was beginning to look increasingly artificial. The mountain did not care whether oxygen was sporting. The real question was whether an apparatus could deliver enough benefit without failing. The team established a camp at approximately 27,200 feet. Shipton and Smythe attempted to climb higher, but encountered deep, powdery snow. Tillman and Lloyd tried another line toward the ridge, only to be stopped by difficult rock and deteriorating conditions. The expedition also found an alternative way onto the North Col from the west, expanding geographical knowledge but not resolving the upper mountain. Once again, the monsoon arrived early. The 1938 expedition would be the last official pre-war British attempt. It had not failed through lack of skill. Its climbers included some of the strongest Himalayan mountaineers alive. It failed because the margin between possible and impossible on Everest was narrower than the available forecasting, equipment, oxygen technology, and weather window. The world was also moving toward a catastrophe larger than any mountain. In 1939, Europe entered war. Everest disappeared from the expedition calendar. Part 9. War, Borders, and the Last Unauthorized Dreamer. 21. Everest in a Changing Asia. The Second World War transformed Britain, India, Nepal, Tibet, and the international order. The British Empire emerged weakened. India became independent in 1947. China's civil war approached its conclusion, and the political future of Tibet became increasingly uncertain. The personnel of mountaineering changed as well. The pre-war expeditions had often presented Everest as a British national project, even though their labor systems were multinational and colonial. After the war, Swiss and French teams possessed strong Himalayan ambitions. New Zealand climbers began to emerge. India and Nepal increasingly asserted their own national relationships to the mountain. The northern route was still technically known, but political access could not be assumed. Before it closed, one more unauthorized adventurer attempted to slip through. 22. Earl Denman's illegal expedition of 1947. Earl Denman was a Canadian-born engineer who had worked in southern Rhodesia. Like Maurice Wilson, he possessed little experience appropriate to Everest. Unlike Wilson, he did not imagine that prayer alone would carry him to the summit. His dream was romantic, minimalist, and almost deliberately outside official mountaineering institutions. Denman traveled to Darjeeling and persuaded Tenzing Norgay and Angdawa to accompany him. The party had no official permission and only limited equipment. They crossed toward Tibet in disguise and advanced to Rongbuk. Tenzing knew the plan was underprepared. He nevertheless felt the pull of another opportunity to return to Everest. By 1947, he had participated in several expeditions without being granted the full status or autonomy of the European climbers. Denman's tiny party was reckless. but it offered Tenzing a more direct climbing role. The three men pushed toward the North Col and reached roughly 22,000 feet before severe weather stopped them. Their tent and equipment were inadequate for prolonged exposure. Denman listened when Tenzing and Ang Dawa advised retreat. That decision distinguishes him from a suicidal fanatic. He had gambled irresponsibly, but when the mountain made the danger unmistakable, he did not insist that his companions die for his vision. They returned safely. The Denman expedition was the final quixotic episode of the Northern Era. Soon, geopolitical change closed the Tibetan approach to Western expeditions. The future of Everest shifted south. Part 10. Nepal opens, and the mountain changes shape. 23. The northern door closes. By 1950, Chinese power was extending into Tibet. The political circumstances that had allowed British expeditions to travel through the Rongbuk Valley disappeared. For foreign mountaineers, the northern route became inaccessible. At almost the same moment, Nepal began cautiously opening to outside expeditions. This reversal was one of the great accidents of mountaineering history. For 3 decades, climbers had invested their knowledge in the North Col and Northeast Ridge. Now they had to begin again on a side of the mountain they had seen only from distant viewpoints and aerial photographs. The southern side was not a mirror image of the north. It presented an entirely different sequence of obstacles. The entrance was the Khumbu Icefall, where the Khumbu Glacier descends steeply over uneven terrain. Glacial movement fractures the ice into towers, blocks, crevasses, and unstable walls. The entire structure moves. A route found one week may be damaged the next. Seracs can collapse without warning. Snow can conceal openings that extend hundreds of feet downward. Above the icefall lay the western Tibet, a broad glacial valley enclosed by Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse. Mallory had supplied the name from the Welsh word Tibet, meaning a bowl-shaped valley. The place could become surprisingly hot under direct sun because surrounding snow and ice reflected radiation into the enclosed basin. Yet when the sun disappeared, temperatures fell rapidly. At the head of the Tibet rose the Lhotse face, a wall of hard blue ice leading toward the South Col. Beyond the col, climbers would have to ascend the southeast ridge, cross the south summit, traverse a dangerously corniced ridge, overcome a final rock barrier, and reach the summit. No one yet knew whether this chain could be completed. 24. The 1950 reconnaissance. In 1950, a small Anglo-American party, including Bill Tillman and Charles Houston, received permission to examine Everest from Nepal. They had only a few days in the immediate region, but they climbed a viewpoint near Pumori and studied the Khumbu Icefall. Houston was an American physician and mountaineer who had already led expeditions to K2. Tillman brought unmatched exploratory experience. From above, they saw the icefall's broken surface and the hidden western CWM beyond it. They could not prove that a route existed, but they concluded that the icefall might be forced. The conclusion was cautious. The icefall was dangerous, unattractive, and unstable, but it did not appear categorically impossible. Another event in 1950 changed Himalayan expectations. A French expedition, led by Maurice Herzog, made the first ascent of Annapurna, with Herzog and Louis Lachenal reaching the summit on June 3rd. It was the first confirmed ascent of any mountain above 8,000 meters. Their descent became a nightmare of frostbite, confusion, lost equipment, avalanche danger, and medical catastrophe. Herzog and Lachenal suffered devastating injuries, yet their success proved that an 8,000-meter summit could be reached. The psychological barrier had fallen. Everest remained higher, harder to supply, and, in its final sections, technically uncertain, but it no longer represented a class of altitude never attained by human beings. The race intensified. Part 11. The southern route is found. 25. Shipton returns in 1951. The British organised a full reconnaissance in 1951 under Eric Shipton. The team included Tom Bourdillon, Bill Murray, Michael Ward, Earl Ridderford, and a tall, angular New Zealander named Edmund Hillary. Hillary was 31, the son of a beekeeper, and worked in the family beekeeping business. The seasonal rhythm suited mountaineering. Intense work during the warmer months could leave time for climbing. He had developed strength in the southern Alps of New Zealand, where unstable snow, broken glaciers, sudden storms, and long approaches rewarded practical judgment. He did not resemble the polished British gentleman alpinist of the pre-war era. He was lanky, large-footed, direct in speech, and unimpressed by social performance. On a mountain, however, he was inventive, competitive, immensely strong, and unusually willing to do the unglamorous labor of route-making. Michael Ward, a physician and climber, had studied maps and photographs suggesting a southern passage into the western Sebelem. Earl Ridderford helped secure New Zealand participation. Shipton brought his intuitive genius for terrain. Ang Tharkai, one of the most respected Himalayan mountaineers of the period, served as Serdar, or head of the high-altitude workforce. The expedition entered the Khumbu Icefall. Here, Hillary's talents became apparent. He helped explore crevasses, snow bridges, and ice walls, searching for a continuous line through a moving labyrinth. Travel through an icefall requires a particular mentality. A climber must think not only vertically but structurally. Is a snow bridge supported or hollow? Is an ice tower leaning? Does a crevasse narrow below the visible opening or widen? Can a ladder, rope, or chopped step create a temporary crossing? Will the route remain usable by load carriers? The party gradually climbed higher. Avalanches and collapsing ice reminded them that no route through the icefall could be made safe. Near its upper end, they encountered a giant crevasse stretching across the glacier. The obstacle appeared to block entry into the western Sebedwa. Shipton was reluctant to expose the team to escalating risk at the end of the season. The expedition withdrew, but not before establishing the central fact. The Khumbu Icefall could be climbed, the western Sidababem could be entered, and a route appeared to continue toward the Lhotse Face and South Col. For the first time, Everest possessed a plausible southern route. Hillary returned from the reconnaissance convinced that the mountain could be climbed from Nepal. The British now possessed a route, but not unrestricted time. Nepal granted the Swiss permission to attempt Everest in 1952. The British would have their next opportunity in 1953. The Swiss nearly made the British expedition unnecessary. Part 12. The Swiss and Tenzing come close. 26. A different kind of expedition. The 1952 Swiss expedition was led by Edouard Huis-Dunant. Its climbers came from one of Europe's strongest alpine traditions and brought technical confidence, teamwork, and experience on steep snow and ice. The Swiss relationship with Tenzing Norgay differed in important ways from the older colonial hierarchy. Tenzing was treated increasingly as a climbing partner and full expedition member rather than only as a high-altitude load carrier. This recognition matched reality. By 1952, he had been on Everest repeatedly since 1935 and possessed more direct knowledge of the mountain than almost any living person. The Swiss forced a route through the Khumbu icefall, crossed the crevasse that had stopped Shipton's party, and entered the western Tsidadareiem. They then confronted the Lhotse face. Climbing the face required cutting steps and securing a route on hard ice. Loads had to move upward, while camps below remained supplied. The South Col, an enormous, wind-swept saddle between Everest and Lhotse, was reached on May 12th by members of the party. The South Col is not a comfortable resting place. It is a high desert of snow, rock, discarded spindrift, and wind. The human body cannot recover there in the ordinary sense. A climber may sleep, drink, and eat, but deterioration continues. The col is useful because it provides a place for tents and a direct approach to the southeast ridge, not because it offers shelter. The leading summit pair became Raymond Lambert and Tenzing. Lambert was an experienced Swiss guide who had lost toes to frostbite years earlier. He combined toughness with warmth and formed a close bond with Tenzing. Their partnership was not free of the cultural inequalities of the period, but it was founded upon genuine mutual trust. They climbed the southeast ridge and established an extraordinarily high bivouac at approximately 8,400 meters. Their equipment was insufficient. They lacked proper sleeping bags and a reliable stove, and melted a small quantity of snow over a candle. Their oxygen apparatus malfunctioned. On May 28th, they continued upward. Estimates of their highest point vary, but they reached approximately 8,600 meters, higher than anyone had climbed on the southern side, and within about 250 vertical meters of the summit. They were exhausted. The oxygen sets were failing. The summit ridge still contained unknown obstacles. The monsoon was approaching. Lambert and Tenzing turned around. Their retreat was not defeat in the ordinary sense. They had established the viability of the southeast ridge, identified the physical demands of a very high camp, and shown that Tenzing could perform as one of the strongest summit climbers in the world. The Swiss returned for an autumn attempt, but severe cold, wind, and seasonal conditions stopped them. Tenzing carried a red scarf given to him by Lambert. He would wear it again on Everest the following year. The British now knew that the mountain was possible. They also knew that another strong expedition might climb it first. Part 13, 1953. 27. Shipton is replaced. Many climbers expected Eric Shipton to lead the 1953 British expedition. He had found the southern route and embodied decades of Himalayan exploration. But the Mount Everest Committee wanted a more structured, assault-oriented organization. The decision was made to replace him with Colonel John Hunt. The choice caused resentment. Hillary and others admired Shipton and initially regarded Hunt as an outsider imposed by committees. Hunt, however, possessed qualities precisely suited to the final stage of the Everest problem. He was a professional soldier, an experienced climber, an excellent organizer, and a leader who understood that authority had to be earned. He did not try to overwhelm the team with rank. He listened, climbed with them during training, and explained his strategy. Gradually, suspicion gave way to respect. Hunt saw Everest as a collective system. The expedition would not depend upon a single heroic pair improvising from an inadequately supplied camp. It would establish a robust chain through the icefall, place large quantities of food and oxygen in the western Tibet, fix the Lhotse face, occupy the South Col, and support more than one summit attempt. His approach combined the logistical strength of the great pre-war expeditions with the route knowledge and climbing efficiency developed by Shipton and the Swiss. The climbing team included Hillary, Tenzing, Charles Evans, a surgeon and the deputy leader, Tom Bourdillon, a physicist deeply involved in oxygen development, George Lowe, another powerful New Zealand climber, Wilfred Noyce, Alf Gregory, George Band, Michael Westmacott, Charles Wiley, and others. The physiologist Griffith Pugh played a role whose importance was less visible to the public, but fundamental to success. The expedition was not small. Hundreds of porters helped carry more than 7 tons of equipment toward base camp. A core group of roughly 20 high-altitude Sherpas would move loads above it. Money for wages had to be transported and guarded. Food, tents, rope, fuel, oxygen cylinders, medical supplies, cameras, batteries, spare parts, and personal equipment all had to arrive intact. Everest climbing at this level was no longer a private duel. It was industrial logistics, conducted in one of the least industrial environments on Earth. 28. The science behind the climb. Griffith Pugh's research helped turn years of high-altitude experience into a systematic performance strategy. He studied oxygen flow rates, clothing, hydration, nutrition, ventilation, sleep, and acclimatization. One of the central lessons was that climbers at altitude often became dangerously dehydrated. Cold suppresses thirst, while rapid breathing increases water loss. Melting snow requires fuel and time, so exhausted climbers may drink too little precisely when their bodies need more fluid. Dehydration thickens the blood, weakens circulation, reduces performance, and may worsen cold injury. Pugh emphasized sufficient fluid intake and measured oxygen use. Supplemental oxygen had to be delivered at rates that meaningfully improved performance without exhausting the finite cylinder supply before the climbers returned. Clothing and sleeping systems had to preserve warmth without becoming impossibly heavy. The expedition used 2 principal oxygen designs: the closed-circuit system, developed in part by Tom Bourdillon and his father, recycled exhaled gas after removing carbon dioxide and adding oxygen. In theory, it used oxygen efficiently and could provide a high effective concentration. In practice, it was complex and vulnerable to malfunction. The open-circuit system released oxygen into the climber's mask and discharged exhaled gas into the atmosphere. It was less efficient in terms of oxygen consumption, but mechanically simpler. Hillary and Tenzing would use open-circuit sets. These scientific developments did not eliminate suffering. A climber still had to carry the apparatus, monitor gauges, clear ice, adjust valves, and continue upward. But by 1953, oxygen was no longer an improvised curiosity. It had become integrated into a deliberate climbing system. The old moral objection that oxygen was somehow dishonorable had lost force. Everest did not award virtue for cerebral hypoxia. The serious ethical question was whether the expedition had used every reasonable means to return its members alive. 29. Through the Khumbu Icefall. Base camp was established on the Khumbu Glacier in April. Above it, the icefall moved continuously. A specialized party worked on the route. Crevasses were bridged with ladders or improvised structures. Steps were cut, ropes were fixed, dangerous passages were marked. Even after the route was established, it had to be maintained. Ice shifted, ladders tilted, snow bridges weakened, and seracs collapsed. The expedition's high-altitude Sherpas carried load after load through this terrain. Their work was repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous. A summit climber might cross the icefall several times. Load carriers crossed it again and again, because every tent, oxygen cylinder, food box, and fuel container in the western CWM had to be moved through by human effort. The mountain's public story tended to narrow toward the summit pair, but the route beneath them resembled a circulatory system. If movement stopped below, the summit attempt died above. Hunt's organization created a sequence of camps through the icefall and into the western CWM. An advanced base camp was established beneath the Lhotse face. Approximately 4 tons of material eventually moved to that position. The western CWM imposed its own strain. Under direct sun, climbers could feel trapped in a furnace of reflected radiation, even though the air remained bitterly cold in shade. Crevasses crossed the glacier. Distances appeared shorter than they were. At altitude, the long walk toward the Lhotse face became a daily drain on strength. The expedition was succeeding, not because conditions had become easy, but because each problem was being prevented from collapsing the whole chain. 30. The Lhotse face. The Lhotse face rises in a broad sweep of hard ice at the head of the western CWM. To reach the South Col, the expedition had to climb and secure roughly 1,000 vertical meters of it. Wilfred Noyce played a central role in forcing the route. Fixed ropes were installed, so climbers and high-altitude workers could ascend while carrying loads. Step cutting remained necessary in places. A slip on the hard surface could accelerate quickly, and the rope system had to function for people moving at different speeds and levels of fatigue. More than 1,000 feet of fixed rope were used on the face and associated sections. Camps were placed progressively higher, including one in the region of the Geneva Spur, the dark rock formation guarding the approach to the South Col. On May 21st, Noyce and Anulu reached the South Col. The route to the final ridge was open, but opening the route and sustaining an assault were different achievements. Tents, oxygen, fuel, food, and sleeping equipment now had to be carried to the col. The expedition needed enough reserves for 2 summit attempts and enough strength to rescue or support climbers returning in distress. Hunt himself carried loads high on the mountain. His willingness to suffer with the team strengthened his authority. He was not preserving himself as a ceremonial commander. Yet he also recognized that his role was to coordinate the summit attempts rather than claim one for himself. The first pair would be Bourdillon and Evans, using the closed-circuit oxygen system. The second, held in reserve, would be Hillary and Tenzing using open-circuit equipment. 31. Bourdillon and Evans reach the south summit. Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans left the South Col on May 26th. Bourdillon was cerebral, technically inventive, and deeply invested in the closed-circuit sets. Evans, a surgeon and experienced mountaineer, was steady and analytical. Their attempt would test both the route and the more complicated oxygen technology. They climbed rapidly by the standards of extreme altitude. The southeast ridge rises from the South Col toward a prominent dome known as the balcony, and then continues to the south summit. The oxygen apparatus improved their performance when functioning correctly. But Evans's set began to cause problems, absorbing time and energy. At approximately 1 p.m., the pair reached the south summit, around 28,700 feet. For the first time, climbers could see the final route in detail. A narrow, corniced ridge descended slightly, and then rose toward the true summit. Partway along it stood a steep rock barrier. The top was tantalizingly close, perhaps only a few hundred vertical feet, but the traverse was unknown. The hour late, the oxygen system unreliable, and both men tired. Bourdillon and Evans turned back. Their decision was bitter but correct. Had they continued, they might have reached the summit and died during descent. Instead, they returned with indispensable information. The southeast ridge was climbable to the south summit, the true summit could be seen, and the remaining obstacle was real but perhaps solvable. The first assault had not failed strategically. It had completed the reconnaissance for the second. Bourdillon would later be overshadowed by Hillary and Tenzing, but reaching the south summit with Evans was one of the greatest climbs made on Everest to that date. The route was ready. The weather had to hold. 32. The supporting climb to Camp 9. Hillary and Tenzing prepared to leave the South Col. Their support party included George Low, Alf Gregory, and Ang Nyama. The goal was to establish a final camp as high as possible on the southeast ridge. Every additional foot gained while carrying the tent and supplies would reduce the work required on summit morning. But the support climbers also had to descend safely. They climbed heavily laden. At extreme altitude, the weight of a tent, stove, food, sleeping bags, and oxygen becomes crushing. The slope above the South Col offered few level platforms. The ridge fell away thousands of feet to either side. Near 27,900 feet, Hillary and Tenzing found a place where a small ledge could be cut from the snow and ice. Low, Gregory, and Ong Nima helped establish the camp, then began their descent. Camp 9 consisted of a small tent pitched on an insecure platform, anchored in part with oxygen cylinders. It was among the highest camps ever occupied. Below, the South Col seemed distant. Above, the summit remained unseen beyond the ridge. Hillary removed his boots and discovered that they had frozen. Frozen leather boots could not be forced onto swollen feet in the morning. Without boots, the climb was over, and survival was doubtful. He spent considerable time warming and thawing them over the stove. The task consumed fuel and required care. Damaging the leather would have been as disastrous as leaving it frozen. Tenzing and Hillary ate and drank as much as they could. The temperature outside fell to approximately -27 degrees Celsius. Oxygen helped them rest, but sleep at that height was shallow and uncertain. They were alone now. Hillary was 33, large, practical, and fiercely ambitious. Tenzing was an Everest veteran who had come within reach of the summit the year before. Their backgrounds were radically different, but their partnership worked because neither treated the other as ornamental. The rope between them represented something literal. Each man's life depended upon the other. 33. May 29th, 1953. Hillary and Tenzing left Camp 9 at approximately 6:30 on the morning of May 29th. The weather was cold but manageable. Their oxygen sets functioned. They moved slowly upward, following portions of the route made by Bourdillon and Evans. At one point, Hillary noticed that his oxygen flow had become restricted. Ice had formed in the system. The problem had to be diagnosed and cleared. A minor obstruction at sea level would have been an inconvenience. At nearly 28,000 feet, it threatened the entire attempt. They continued toward the south summit. A steep section of approximately 400 feet was dangerously exposed and potentially avalanche-prone. Hillary cut steps. Tenzing followed, maintaining the rope and climbing with the endurance that had already brought him high on Everest repeatedly. They reached the south summit at about 9 a.m. The true summit stood ahead, separated by the corniced ridge seen by Bourdillon and Evans. The traverse demanded concentration. Snow cornices can project beyond the supporting rock like frozen waves. A climber who walks too far toward the outer edge may break the entire structure away. Hillary and Tenzing stayed on the safer side, cutting steps and probing the snow while the ridge dropped dramatically beneath them. Then they reached the final rock barrier. 34. The Step. The obstacle later called the Hillary Step rose approximately 40 feet. On one side stood rock. On the other hung a cornice above the immense drop of the Kangshung face. Hillary examined it and found a narrow crack between the rock and the corniced snow. The line was awkward and frightening. At lower altitude, a strong climber might have treated it as a brief technical puzzle. Near 29,000 feet, every movement had to be made while wearing heavy clothing, oxygen apparatus, gloves, and cramponed boots. He entered the crack, pressing backward against the snow and using the rock for support. He wriggled and levered himself upward. The cornice might have broken. A crampon could have slipped. The oxygen tubing could have snagged. Tenzing held the rope below. Hillary reached the top and secured the rope. Tenzing followed. The final major obstacle had been passed. Above the step, the ridge continued in a series of snow slopes and rises. Each time they approached what appeared to be the summit, another small elevation appeared beyond it. They were moving inside a physiological condition in which the mind could narrow to one action: plant the axe, kick or cut the step, move the foot, breathe, bring the other foot upward, breathe again. Eventually, Hillary saw that the ridge no longer rose ahead. At 11:30 a.m., he and Tenzing stepped onto the summit of Everest. 35. 15 minutes on top of the world. The summit was a small crest of snow, not a broad platform. The sky was intensely clear. Mountains extended beneath them in every direction, their summits appearing diminished by the extraordinary height from which Hillary and Tenzing viewed them. They did not collapse into an embrace for a waiting camera. There was no one else present. Hillary shook Tenzing's hand. Tenzing embraced him. Hillary photographed Tenzing standing with his ice axe. Attached to it were the flags of Britain, Nepal, India, and the United Nations. Tenzing did not know how to operate Hillary's camera, and Hillary did not think to teach him there. Consequently, there is no known summit photograph of Hillary from the ascent. Tenzing made an offering of sweets and biscuits in the snow. Hillary placed a small crucifix given to Hunt by a British cleric. These acts brought two religious worlds to the summit: Tenzing's Himalayan Buddhist offering and Hillary's placement of a Christian object. Hillary also looked for possible signs that Mallory and Irvine had been there. He saw none. They remained on the summit for approximately 15 minutes. Their oxygen supply and the need to descend imposed discipline. A summit is only the midpoint of a successful climb. Hillary took photographs that would verify their position. Tenzing stood in his red scarf from Raymond Lambert, carrying the memory of the Swiss attempt onto the summit the two men had nearly reached together. Then Hillary and Tenzing turned downward. The mountain had not changed. Gravity, cold, cornices, exhaustion, and oxygen failure remained as dangerous as before. They had to reverse every difficult movement. 36. We knocked the bastard off. The descent through the steppe and across the corniced ridge required care. Down climbing is often more dangerous than ascent because the climber is tired, visibility of footholds is worse, and the emotional pressure of the summit has been released. They reached their high camp, gathered what they could, and continued toward the South Col. George Low climbed upward to meet them, carrying hot soup and support. Hillary's first famous report to his fellow New Zealander was characteristically blunt. "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." The sentence captured relief rather than domination. Hillary had spent hours reducing the greatest geographical objective of his life to immediate problems: a frozen boot, an oxygen blockage, a steep slope, a cornice, a crack. Only after descending could he acknowledge that the entire mountain had been climbed. At the South Col, Hunt greeted them. Tenzing gestured to indicate that they had reached the top. The expedition's emotional center shifted instantly. Years of preparation and weeks of labor had become success, but the news still had to travel out of the Himalaya. The message was encoded so that competing newspapers could not easily intercept it. Correspondent James Morris, later known as Jan Morris, helped transmit the report. Runners, radio links, and telegraph systems carried it toward London. News reached Britain on June 2nd, the morning of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. The timing turned the ascent into a symbol of national renewal. British newspapers celebrated it as a final flowering of imperial adventure, even though the summit pair consisted of a New Zealander and a Himalayan climber. The mountain stood between Nepal and Tibet, and the expedition's success had depended upon international knowledge. Hillary and Hunt were knighted. Tenzing received the George Medal from Britain and extraordinary honours in Nepal and India. Arguments soon arose over who had stepped onto the summit first, often driven by national pride and colonial assumptions. Hillary had climbed the step first because the geometry of the rope required one climber to lead. Near the summit, he also moved slightly ahead while cutting steps. But treating this as proof that Hillary conquered Everest, while Tenzing merely followed, falsifies the nature of roped climbing. They reached the summit as a team. Hillary's route finding and strength were indispensable. Tenzing's altitude experience, endurance, support, and judgment were equally essential. Each had accepted the possibility of dying with the other. The correct unit of achievement was not a single footprint. It was the rope. Part 14. The people behind the summit. 37. Tenzing Norgay, from invisible labour to world figure. No life better reveals the transformation of Himalayan mountaineering than Tenzing's. When he joined the 1935 expedition, European institutions still tended to classify Himalayan participants as support workers rather than mountaineers with ambitions of their own. Tenzing returned in 1936 and 1938, accompanied Denman in 1947, joined the 1951 reconnaissance, came close with Lambert in 1952, and reached the summit in 1953. By then, he was not simply the most famous Sherpa climber. He was among the most experienced Everest climbers alive. His skill did not consist merely of unusual biological adaptation. Sherpa high-altitude performance is sometimes romanticized as effortless or innate, a myth that diminishes training, suffering, courage, and judgment. Tenzing became strong because he worked repeatedly at altitude, learned expedition systems, understood snow and camps, endured failure, and wanted the summit with an intensity equal to that of any European climber. His ascent also became a political symbol. Nepal celebrated him. India celebrated him because of his life in Darjeeling. Himalayan communities saw a man from their world standing at the center of an achievement previously narrated as British. Competing claims over his nationality demonstrated that Everest could no longer be contained within the old imperial framework. Tenzing's summit offering is especially revealing. He did not arrive merely as an employee entering an empty geographical point. He acknowledged the summit as a place within a sacred world. The modern mountaineer and the traditional Himalayan believer stood in the same boots. 38. Edmund Hillary, the practical imagination. Hillary became internationally associated with modesty, but modesty should not be confused with lack of ambition. He wanted the summit intensely. He competed for a place on the final team, tested himself against the strongest climbers, and recognized opportunity quickly. His great quality was practical imagination. He could look at an ice fall, crevasse, slope, or crack, and search for what could be done immediately. He did not need a route to appear elegant. It needed to work. This temperament had been shaped in New Zealand's Southern Alps and refined in the Khumbu icefall. It proved ideal at the final rock step. Hillary did not solve it by applying a formal doctrine. He found a gap between rock and snow and forced his body through it. Yet Hillary's post-Everest life suggests that the climb did not leave him with a simple ideology of conquest. He developed deep relationships with Sherpa communities and supported schools, hospitals, bridges, and other projects through the Himalayan Trust. Those later activities do not erase the inequalities of expeditionary mountaineering, but they show that his relationship with the Everest region became personal and enduring. On May 29, 1953, Hillary supplied the final lead. He did so because countless others had supplied the route beneath him. 39. John Hunt and the Architecture of Success. Hunt's achievement was less photogenic than the summit, but no less consequential. He designed an expedition capable of absorbing setbacks. The first oxygen system could malfunction without ending the entire attempt. The first summit pair could turn back without leaving no one ready to continue. Support climbers could establish the final camp and descend. Oxygen reserves were calculated. High-altitude workers were organized into a supply system. Medical and physiological recommendations shaped hydration, clothing, and flow rates. This was not the romantic ideal of two men walking away from civilization and improvising toward the unknown. It was a collective architecture of redundancy. Hunt also overcame the resentment created by Shipton's removal. A weaker leader might have divided the expedition into factions. Hunt persuaded strong, ambitious men to accept roles that might deny them the summit. George Low and Alf Gregory carried loads upward, knowing they would descend before the final attempt. Noyce forced the lot's face without standing on the top. Bourdillon and Evans turned back after reaching the south summit and then supported the success of those who followed. The expedition worked because these actions were treated as parts of one objective. The summit pair became famous. The structure made fame possible. Part 15. What conquest concealed. 40. The labor beneath the heroic photograph. The traditional heroic narrative concentrates naturally at the summit, because that is where the objective is completed. But Everest is climbed from below. Every oxygen cylinder used by Hillary and Tenzing had been manufactured, transported to South Asia, carried toward the mountain, moved through the Khumbu icefall, hauled across the western CWM, lifted up the Lhotse face, and delivered to the South Col or higher. Every cup of liquid began as fuel and snow. Every night of rest required a tent platform. Every step on a fixed route reflected someone else's earlier work. The expedition included hundreds of people whose names rarely appeared in headlines. Low-altitude porters carried loads on the approach. High-altitude Sherpas repeatedly entered the icefall. Cooks, interpreters, mail runners, medical workers, equipment specialists, and liaison personnel sustained the traveling community. This does not reduce Hillary and Tenzing's achievement. They alone endured the final ridge on May 29th. But it changes the meaning of the ascent from solitary heroism to collective human organization. Everest was reached by two climbers. It was climbed by an expedition. 41. The knowledge accumulated through failure. The route to the summit can be reconstructed as a chain of inherited discoveries. The 1921 expedition mapped the northern approaches and identified the North Col. The 1922 climbers demonstrated that human beings could exceed 27,000 feet and that supplemental oxygen could substantially improve performance. The avalanche exposed the lethal consequences of unstable snow and rushed judgment. Norton and Somerville demonstrated in 1924 that a superbly acclimatized climber could approach 28,000 feet without oxygen. Mallory and Irvine revealed the terrible uncertainty of pressing upward without reliable communication or a secure descent margin. The 1933 expedition confirmed the difficulty of the second step and Norton Traverse. Smythe's solo climb illustrated both human endurance and the neurological strangeness of extreme altitude. Wilson demonstrated negatively that will, spirituality, and courage could not replace technical preparation. Shipton's 1935 expedition showed the exploratory power of a small team and brought Tenzing into Everest history. The 1936 and 1938 attempts revealed the decisive authority of monsoon snow and weather. Denman's retreat showed the wisdom of listening before ambition became fatal. The 1950 reconnaissance identified the Khumbu icefall as possible. The 1951 expedition found the southern route. The Swiss in 1952 opened the way to the South Col and demonstrated that the southeast ridge could be climbed to approximately 8,600 meters. Bourdillon and Evans revealed the final ridge. Hillary and Tenzing completed what all of them had begun. 42. The Sacred Mountain after the summit. The 1953 ascent did not secularize Everest completely. Chomolungma remained the abode of sacred powers within Tibetan and Sherpa understanding. Puja ceremonies continued. Climbers continued to request blessings, even when they interpreted them differently from the lamas conducting them. Nor did the ascent establish permanent human mastery. The mountain continued to kill strong and experienced climbers. Routes changed. Avalanches destroyed camps. Storms overwhelmed technology. Oxygen systems failed. The upper mountain preserved the same fundamental indifference it had shown to Mallory, Wilson, and the 7 men killed in 1922. The language of conquest belonged partly to the historical moment. Britain received the news on coronation morning and understood it through the fading imagery of empire. Newspapers wanted a victory, a hero, and a flag. But Everest resisted that simplification. The mountain had a Tibetan name before it had a British one. Its height was established through calculations involving an Indian mathematician. Its early expeditions depended on Tibetan permission and Himalayan labor. Its southern route lay in Nepal. A Swiss team nearly completed it. A New Zealander and a Himalayan Sherpa stood on top. The summit displayed 4 flags rather than 1. The achievement was not the final assertion of one empire. It was an early sign that the history of exploration had become irreducibly international. Epilogue. The highest place. On the morning of May 29th, 1953, Hillary and Tenzing climbed into a region where ordinary human life is impossible. They crossed snow that might have broken beneath them, negotiated a ridge above immense drops, and forced a way through the last rock barrier. Their oxygen sets worked long enough. Their bodies retained enough strength. The weather remained calm enough. Their judgment didn't fail. These conditions sound simple only after they have all occurred together. For 32 years, expeditions had arrived with different theories of success. Some trusted courage, some trusted oxygen, some trusted mass organization, some trusted lightness. Maurice Wilson trusted faith. Denman trusted audacity. Shipton trusted improvisation. Hunt trusted systems. Each theory contained part of the truth, and, when treated as the whole truth, a route to failure. Everest required courage, but courage disciplined by retreat. It required technology, but technology understood as fallible. It required ambition, but ambition distributed across a team. It required local knowledge, scientific knowledge, logistical knowledge, and the bodily knowledge acquired only by climbing high and discovering what remained possible. Above all, it required continuity. The successful climbers inherited tracks that storms had erased physically, but history had preserved intellectually. When Hilary looked at the final step, he did not stand there alone. Behind him stood Mallory, studying the north call from the Lakpa La. Finch adjusting his oxygen apparatus. Norton traversing alone into the great couloir. Somerville struggling to clear his throat. Odell staring through a break in the cloud. Smythe offering mint cake to an invisible companion. Wilson pushing upward without crampon skill. Shipton peering into the Khumbu icefall. Tenzing carrying loads on expedition after expedition. Lambert sharing a freezing bivouac. Pugh calculating oxygen and water. Noyce fixing the Lhotse face. Bourdillon and Evans turning back from the south summit. Lowe, Gregory, and Ang Nima carrying the final camp upward. The sacred traditions surrounding Chomolungma had always insisted, in different ways, that the mountain was more than an object. The history of the ascent reached a similar conclusion. Everest was never merely a summit waiting to be occupied. It was a landscape of gods and governments, monasteries and maps, ambition and grief, science and hallucination, human inequality and human partnership. It became a screen upon which nations projected prestige and individuals projected longing. It drew careful explorers, brilliant climbers, decorated soldiers, wounded mystics, professional guides, scientists, porters, photographers, surveyors, and dreamers. Some approached it with reverence. Some approached it with confidence. Some approached it with delusion. All were made small by the same wind. Hilary and Tenzing were the first to reach the summit and return with proof. Yet even their triumph did not settle the ancient relationship between human beings and the mountain. It merely added a new story to it. The story of two climbers tied to the same rope, emerging above the final rise and discovering that there was nowhere higher to go. For 15 minutes they stood at the highest place on earth. Then, as every mountaineer must, they turned back toward the living.